Now that we're familiar with toolbars, we're going to use the opportunity to build an EggTimer app where the timer controls are all bar button items in navigation bars or toolbars. Before we do that though, we'll need to learn how to use timers in Swift. And this will be our first example as well of using an iOS timer object, which works in the same way as most objects in iOS. So let's see how this is going to work. We'll jump over to our viewcontroller.swift, and I'm going to put my code here in viewDidLoad. And to create a timer, we create a variable, which I'm going to call timer, and we set it equal to timer with a capital T. So what we're doing here is creating an object, timer with a little t, which has a type or class of timer with a big T. And remember, I mentioned classes usually start with capital letters, and objects or particular instances or examples of them usually start with lowercase letters. So we've got our lowercase t timer object, which we're going to be able to use all the timer functions on because we've created it from the general timer class. Okay, so now we need to decide how we want our timer to behave. So we take our timer and we set it equal to timer, that is capital T timer, dot scheduled timer. So you can see we've got quite a few options here. The one that we want is the one with selector in it there. So that's down the second one for me. So I'm going to select all of that. You can see that Xcode gives you all this nice predicted code, which should make our life quite a bit easier. So we're creating a scheduled timer from the general timer class with a time interval of whatever we want it to be. So I'm going to make it so this timer happens every 1 second. The target is the view controller that we're working with. Now, most of the time, the view controller that we want the timer to work with is the one that we're actually on, and we can get that using the self keyword. So we normally use self for target within timers and indeed other objects as well. So that just says that we're targeting this particular view controller here. And then we've got to enter our selector, which essentially is asking us what do we want to happen every second. And that's all the timer does. It just does something every second, and we want to tell it what. So what I'm going to do is create a function using the same code as we have here. It's not an override function because it doesn't already exist. We're creating it ourselves. So I'll use func, and I'll call it process timer. There we go. And anything in here will then be part of the process timer function or method. So to link up our timer with our process timer function, we use selector with a capital S and then the name of the function. So process timer there. So this essentially means every 1 second we want to run the process timer method up here, which we haven't decided what it's going to do yet. We'll decide that in a moment. User info is if we want to send any particular info with our timer, which we don't. So I'm just going to put nil there because we're not sending any info. And repeats, yes, definitely we want this to happen indefinitely, or at least until we tell it to stop. All right, so that's it. That's probably our longest line of code that we've written so far. But essentially what we're doing is we're setting our timer to the general timer class. We're creating a scheduled timer with a time interval of 1, a target of this view controller or self, and we're running the process timer method every time the timer runs or the timer hits 1 second. We're not sending any user info, and we're doing it repeatedly. All right, so all that remains is to do something when the timer runs, and all I'm going to do is print a second has passed. So simple as that. And there you go. You can see that's now running, and I'll have to make that a bit bigger for you to be able to see it in action, but there we go. Every second then we're getting that printed to the console. Wonderful. Now we do have a couple of warnings here that are worth paying attention to. The first is that timer was written to but never read, which is not necessarily a problem, but it does give me an opportunity to show you one other feature of timers that we'll need for our app, and that is the ability to stop them. And that's quite easy to do. We just use timer.invalidate, and that will then stop the timer. So if we ran this, then actually nothing would happen because the timer would be invalidated before it got to 1 second. But what we might want to do, for example, is put the timer.invalidate code in the camera pressed method up here, and then we could use the camera button to stop the timer. If we do that, however, we will get another error because timer is defined down here. So it's not actually accessible up here. It will say use of unresolved identifier timer because timer is not defined up here. So a quick way around that is to define the timer right up here inside the class, but outside any of the methods within it. And this is something called variable scope, which means where a variable is accessible. So if you create a variable within a class or a method, it's only accessible from within that class or method. So if, as we had before, we create timer down here, it won't be accessible up here. If, however, we create it in the class, then it's accessible anywhere within that class, including the camera pressed method here, and indeed the viewDidLoad method as well. So if we were to run this, we would find that the timer runs fine, but when we pressed the camera pressed button, then the timer will stop. And notice we no longer have this warning about the timer because it is used down here when it's stopped. So the warning is just saying you're unlikely to want a timer that just keeps on going forever and never stops. If you definitely do need that, then you can ignore the warning, but generally these warnings are good to get rid of. And this last one is actually a syntax change in Swift 3. So I'm going to replace selector brackets process timer with hash selector and then view controller dot process timer, which is just another way of selecting the process timer method as being what we want to happen when the timer hits 1 second. All right, so that's timers. Now it's time to create our EggTimer app. So now let's see the app that we're going to be making, our glorious EggTimer app. So it starts by default at 210 seconds, and then when you press play, it starts to count down, and you can of course pause the timer by pressing pause and then restarting it by pressing play again. We can also add 10 seconds to the timer by pressing this button, and we can subtract 10 seconds if we want to from the timer as well, so we can get our perfectly timed eggs. And we can also reset the timer back to 210 if we want to. One other thing worth noting is that we can't go below 0. So it would be strange if we could have negative values on our timer. So the -10 button doesn't work if it would take it below 0, and also the timer stops at 0 as well. So there's your challenge. You've got all the skills that you need to make that. So give it a go. Best of luck, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, I hope that went well. Here we go. So I'm going to start by creating a brand new project. Single view application. And this is going to be an egg timer. And I'll save it right there on the desktop. And we'll start by creating our user interface as usual in main storyboard. All right, so I'm going to start by adding my navigation bar at the top. Just like that. And we'll have our app title up there. And I'm going to put a couple of buttons on there as well. So we'll have a pause button. I think there is a pause button. There we go. And we'll also have a play button to begin the timer. Great, so that'll do for those buttons. Then we'll add our toolbar at the bottom. And here we're going to have the options to add and subtract from the timer and also to reset the timer. So down here, we're going to have a -10. Maybe we'll choose -10 like that, put it together. And then we'll add another one, which is going to go on the right. And that's going to be +10. And our third item is going to go in the middle, and that's going to be reset. Okay, and let's put in a bit of flexible space between those so that they're all nicely spread out. There we go. Finally, we'll need a big label in the middle. So I'm going to put that right in the center of the screen, and I'm going to add some constraints to make sure that it's horizontally and vertically centered regardless of the screen size. And then I'm just going to stretch it out a bit. Make it nice and large. There we go. While that's happening, I'll want to set the width and height. There we go. Let's move it back to make sure it is indeed centered. And center the text within it. And we need a starting value. I believe that the perfect boiling time for most eggs is 3.5 minutes, which is 210 seconds. So that should work for us. I'm just going to change the size to something even bigger than that. Let's go for 50. There we go. All right. As we've finished our user interface, always worth having a quick look at what it looks like in other orientations. Lovely. Very nice. And even on the iPad, it's a bit sparse, but it does the trick. Okay. So now we've built our interface, it's time to write the code. So we're going to need to create some IB outlets and IB actions here. Let's get rid of the left and right panes. And I'm going to start by creating the only IB outlet, which is the label itself. So I've just control dragged there. I'm going to call that timer label. And then let's add actions for all of these buttons. So I'm going to call that play. Don't forget to select action. There we go. Same for pause. And then I'll call that plus 10. And then minus 10. Oh, easily done. I forgot the action option. So I'm going to delete that from there. But then I have to make sure that I've deleted the outlet as well. So I'm just going to control click there and delete the outlet. Otherwise you'll get an error when you run the app if you delete an IB outlet from the code and not from the storyboard. So let's try that again. Choose action this time. Same name as before, minus 10. And finally, reset timer. Okay, so now we've got all our IB actions and our IB outlet ready to go. So let's get rid of our interface and focus on our code in viewcontroller.swift. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is create our timer, just as we did earlier in the video. So timer is going to be an object of the class timer. Then we're going to add to the play function or method here our instructions to set up the timer. So let's do that just as we did it before. So we're going to set the timer equal to timer. That is the timer class dot scheduled timer, and we want the one with the selector. That's the top one this time. Xcode generally learns which one you use and then suggests that for you, which is very handy. So time interval is going to be same as before, 1 second. Target, same as before, self, because we want to target this view controller. Now selector, let's use the new Swift syntax. So that's a hash selector. And then we want to select view controller. Dot, and then I'm going to call a function called decrease timer, which I haven't actually created yet. So that's going to give me an error. Let's quickly create it up here. So that's going to be decrease timer. There we go. And then user info, again, we don't need any of that. Repeats is definitely true. All right, now the main difference between this app and the example that we made earlier in the video is that we need to actually keep track of the time this time. So I'm going to create a variable called time, which is initially going to be equal to the value on the label, i.e. 210. And this is going to be the variable that keeps track of what value the timer is at. So the main thing we want to do in the decrease timer function is reduce the time by 1. So one way to do that is time equals time minus 1. But there is a slightly niftier syntax if you want to remove 1 from your integer, and that is just time minus equals 1. And we can use a similar syntax if we wanted to add 1 to the time. So if we were building a stopwatch app, for example, we might want to use time plus equals 1 there, but we're decreasing the timer, so we want to decrease it by 1. And then when the timer is decreased, we're going to want to update the label. So we're going to set timer label dot text. Now we'd like to be able to set it equal to time, but we can't do that because time is an integer and timer label.text is a string. So we just need to convert the integer to a string like that. Now, one small change I'd like to make here is that I'd like this only to happen if the time is greater than 0, because I don't want to get any negative times displaying on my app. I want to stop at 0. And in fact, if the time is not greater than 0, then the time is going to be equal to 0. So I'm going to stop the timer from going. So timer invalidate. This isn't strictly necessary, but I don't like the idea of the timer ticking away and then doing nothing every second. Better to stop the timer. It's a little cleaner, I think. All right, so I'm actually going to run that and test it out. So we should find that we can now tap the play button and we'll see the timer decrease second by second. So here we go. Our app looks good. Keep your fingers crossed. Let's press play. And there we go. So our egg timer is decreasing. Fantastic. All looking good. Okay. So all we need to do now is just set up these functions here so that they do what they're supposed to. So let's start with the pause button. That's actually really simple. All we need to do at the pause button is stop the timer. So that's just timer invalidate. And the +10 button, if that's pressed, then we just take the time and add 10 to it. Simple as that. And also we want to update the timer label. There we go. Now -10 is pretty similar. We're going to take the time and subtract 10 from it, and then update the label as before, but I only want to do that if we're not going to go into negative numbers. So I'm going to check again to make sure that timer is greater than 10. So this will take us down to 1. Oops, that should be time is greater than 10. So if time is less than 10 or equal to 10, then this won't do anything. Okay, nearly there. So then reset timer. All we need to do here is set the time back to our default time, which is 210. And then set the timer label to string time. There we go. So with any luck, that should do everything that we want. We should be able to increase the timer, decrease the timer, pause it, and reset it, as well as start it off in the first place. So let's try it out. Here we go. So we'll start by just pressing play, making sure that that still works. It does. And then pause. That indeed stops the timer. Pressing play again starts it off. Fabulous, we're looking good. And then if we +10, that does indeed add 10 to the timer. And it should work while it's in action as well. There we go. And -10 does indeed decrease the timer. Let's go all the way down to make sure that we can't go below 0. There we go. So -10 doesn't work when we're below 10, and the timer should stop at 0. There we go. Wonderful. So now resetting gets us back to 210, and we can time another egg if we want to. Wonderful. I hope you enjoyed making that one and managed to do a fair bit of it yourself. We're now going to change direction a little, and in the next video we'll look at another fundamental aspect of iOS development, and that is the table view.